Hi, this is Brent Feldman, and we are back with another episode of Mix and Matchbox. Today, I am joined by Jim Perry. He's a consultant at Market Insights. Hi, Jim. How are you doing?
And Brent, I'm doing great. Thanks.
Yeah,
Glad to be here.
definitely. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. I know that we got connected through a mutual contact, and I'm definitely looking forward to digging into some of your past history here. So I know that you've spent 21 years at Market Insights, starting back in Chicago, and you describe yourself as a strategist rather than a banker. And so for someone who, for someone meeting you cold, what does a strategist actually do for a bank? And how did you end up in that seat instead of a kind of traditional sort of financial services career?
Oh, that's a really great question. It's like I don't often stop and think about things like this. But I guess the shortest answer is probably a strategist is going to help a bank kind of position itself for the future, period. So maybe that makes me a strategic futurist. Um, but here's how I talk to clients or somebody I'm meeting for the first time. Um, the word strategy actually comes from the military, right? It originally referred to the general. He's the top guy. He's got to figure out, this is the battlefield we're going to choose today. This is how I'm going to position my forces. This is how I'm going to understand my opponent. And this is how I'm going to kind of deploy my team or my soldiers. And all of that has to happen before the battle actually starts,
Hmm.
right? It's about putting yourself in the strongest possible position in order to kind of achieve the results that you want. And that's exactly what I do for banks and credit unions. And I'm not trying to predict a specific future, one that's like really precise. What I'm trying to do is help leaders understand that the environment they're operating in so they can position themselves regardless of how the future unfolds. Um, you asked how I ended up here.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't set out to enter into financial services, I'm just saying. But I did spend years working with money.
Mm.
Now, I could leave your audience wondering, what's he talking about? What was he doing with money? Before joining Market Insights, I was a professional fundraiser in the not-for-profit sector. And if you know anything about good fundraisers, you know that they're highly analytical. Besides every successful fundraising program always has a mountain of data.
Mm-hmm.
They're always having to go through that data, decide where to invest time before you ever make your first request. And so essentially, that's what brought me to Market Insights, because banks at that time, back in 2005, they were really just starting to realize that they needed people who could recognize patterns in data and who could translate them into kind of better strategic choices. So here, 21 years later, I'm still doing that. Of course, the terrain has changed dramatically. I mean, really, over the last 20 plus years. It's not just branches, it's not just geography, it's data, AI, demographics, all of those things. But it's still about understanding the terrain.
Yeah.
You've got to be able to see those patterns and help an institution really get positioned to win the battle for the customer. So I guess there are some parallels there.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, and it definitely, I know quite a few, development officers at nonprofit organizations, and yeah, understanding the scenario, quote unquote, the battlefield is always truly important. So that's cool that's truly ingrained and definitely a part of not only who you are but what you do now. I think there's a thread that I really love in your story. And it was when we were first talking that caught me, and we have ties to like the architecture industry. And so,
Mhm.
and that's where you live in a Frank Lloyd Wright design community, and you keep,
Mhm.
kind of circling the architecture world. And even, while you work almost exclusively in banking, obviously, which is, not relative necessarily to, the architecture world necessarily, but uh,
Right.
does that design and structure way of thinking show up in sort of how you approach a bank strategy?
Wow. You know, I actually think it does. Because, I mean, think about it. Without any kind of structure, strategy is just wishful thinking. You can't really put up a building without thinking through all the details, the plumbing, the electricity, the foundation, all of those things. And architects like Wright, I mean, they would excel at thinking about the entire picture.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to be able to look at the interdependencies of all those features and functions. You've got to be able to think about the constraints. How much is this going to cost? What's going to be involved in doing this? What's this going to look like 20 years from now? You have to prepare for adaptability. So I really think that kind of way of thinking applies to banking as well as buildings. And one of the things that I've come to appreciate from living in a Frank Lloyd Wright design community is that he believed that a building should kind of grow out of a site as opposed to just be placed on it. A couple of years back, I visited his really famous building, Falling Water in Pennsylvania. I don't know if you've ever been there. It's such a great example of site-specific approach. And I think that's mirrored in a lot of what I do for banks and credit unions, because I'm not a fan of that one-size-fits-all kind of playbook that happens a lot with consultants, because you're not going to get any kind of boilerplate strategy from me. What you end up finding when you've got a 5 billion asset class organization in a growing market and you've got a $400 million mutual in a shrinking market, you can't give them the same strategies. You've got to build something that's really designed for their unique market conditions. So I guess you're right. Architectural way of thinking does find its way into what I do, right?
That's awesome. And not to, further, dive into that analogy, but he was a person who famously thought about not only the outside, but also the inside of the structure. And so, I could imagine, thinking about the full picture of things, that also kind of falls into, what you're doing. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, well, cool. Market Insights had made a deliberate choice in, not bringing everything in-house. And that's very interesting because, like, a lot of organizations are kind of like, okay, well, quote unquote, kind of vertically integrate and bring, everything into the stack. But you frequently will design the strategy and then point the client to the right partner instead of selling them the actual execution. Why did staying an independent sort of voice matter enough to leave the revenue on the table, and how does that change the way you deliver advice to clients?
I think that's a really easy answer, because the moment you start selling on the execution of any strategy, doesn't matter what it is, your advice has a thumb on the scale, whether you want it to or not. If I'm the strategist and the implementer, and I recommend any kind of platform or vendor or partner, how do I ever prove to you that I recommend it because it's right for you and not because it's profitable for me? Our CEO made the call a long time ago that we were going to differentiate ourselves from other consulting firms by remaining that independent, because our clients know that when I say, hey, here's what I think you should do, it's because it fits their size, their culture, their risk profile, not because it gives me a chance to upsell an additional product. It also changes the advice, I think, in a very concrete way. There have been times when I've been able to sit across from a CEO or a C-suite full of folks or a board, and I can be critical. I can say, look, I think your core provider sucks. It's like, or I can say that shiny AI vendor everybody's chasing just isn't right for who you are, without worrying about protecting some kind of downstream relationship. That independence is really pretty important, I think.
That's awesome. That's the clip I'm going to take out of the episode. Your core provider sucks. So, okay.
Oh, I'm going to get so many calls.
I know. Yeah, just kidding. I won't do that to you. That's awesome. No, exactly. I feel like I love that. The impartiality is so important, and that's neat that you guys try to preserve that in that way.
Hmm.
Yeah, and I guess, as far as dealing with financial institutions, your core work has flipped over the years from
Oh, yeah.
helping banks decide where to put the next branch and, find lookalike customers to helping the decide, which branches to close and consolidate so that they can redeploy that capital into potentially tech
Mhm.
and marketing. I guess what does that reversal tell us about where the community banking, sort of like arena is heading right now?
Wow, I think it tells us that, the growth story has not only changed, but it continues to change, and that change is happening fast. As you say, I mean, for most of my career, excuse me, growth really meant physical expansion.
Mm-hmm.
Find the right corner, put a branch on it, find customers who look like your best customers, go get them. That was the playbook. And it worked because the branch was primarily the way that people interacted or experienced their bank.
Mm-hmm.
But now, again, it's the opposite conversations. Banks are looking at the branch network that costs a fortune to run. It's increasingly doesn't move the needle on acquisition. Um, it's just happening on the phone. It's happening in search results. It's happening within an AI chat, long before anybody even gets near a branch. So the strategic questions are flipping from where do we add? And instead, it's like, where do we subtract? Where do we do that responsibly? What do we do with the capital that we free up? And I think what this really tells us is that, especially now in this growing age of AI, community banking is kind of in the middle of relocating its center of gravity.
Yeah.
It's moving from physical presence to digital presence, from geography to discoverability. The banks handling that well are the ones that are treating branch consolidation, not necessarily as like, oh my God, we're leaving this market. Instead, we're funding the things that actually matter and are going to help us be successful.
That's cool. That's truly important, and I think that's such, helpful advice, especially as you give that guidance in a thoughtful way, because it is, the landscape is changing definitively, and as I understand it, like 50% of people are never going to go into a branch. It's just, the case, and if that happens, then, how are they thinking about their technology in a way that exactly doesn't necessarily abandon a market or, a group of people in a specific locality, but, just embraces the changing nature of how people are doing business and specifically banking too.
And the important thing, that 50% you're talking about, again, in urban areas, in large cities, that number's even higher. Oftentimes we'll see trends like this, consumer behavior trends roll out in such a way that it's going to happen in a dense urban area first. Might take 2 years for a suburban or rural area to catch up, but these behaviors are happening across the board.
Yeah, definitely. Wow. Well, you talk about a widening divide. The biggest banks have been building AI for years, and while a lot of smaller institutions kind of kept kicking the can down the road, and the analogy that I keep hearing is all right, we bought some Copilot licenses, we're good.
We're good.
Yeah, we did the thing. But for a community bank or a smaller, or a credit union that knows that it is, behind, what is the honest first move? Like, what is the basically the thing that they can do, and then what's the expensive mistake that you've seen them make when, unfortunately they're, in a panic?
Wow, you're so good at these two-part questions, right?
Sorry,
I love
sorry
this.
about asking so much in one.
No,
And
no,
it's like,
no, it's all good.
yeah.
You know, you're in St. Louis, right?
Hmm.
I recently read a report that came out from the Federal Reserve Bank in St. Louis that was pointing to the fact that a lot of community banks and credit unions are still in those early stages of AI adoption, right? For a lot of them, AI is something that leadership is just now talking about, which is kind of mind-blowing to me. It's like, how could you not have picked up this conversation 2 years ago? But for a lot of them, it's still, we only have a small group of employees doing this or that with AI, with this tool or that tool. And for some, it's just not on their radar screen at all. Hard to believe, but it's true. And across the board, there's so many banks and credit unions where this just isn't an organizational capacity yet. But here's what I think is what's really interesting about all this. What I recommend today, I wouldn't have necessarily recommended 2 years ago, because 2 years ago, I would have said, hey, find a use case, start a pilot, run a pilot. That made perfect sense because 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, we thought that AI's biggest impact was going to be on making internal operations better, right? More efficient.
Mm-hmm.
Today, I'm really less convinced that that's where institutions should start, because bigger disruption may be happening outside of the bank. Like you were saying with the architecture comment, inside and outside. You've got to look at what's going on in terms of your customers. Think of how customers are already using AI to search and compare, get financial advice, increasingly making decisions. If you're only looking inside, you risk solving yesterday's problems. You're not looking towards the future at all. So if an institution knows it's behind, first, I'd say start with that honest inventory. Take a look at your exposure. How are your customers already using AI in ways you're not seeing? Where's the friction in your customer experience that maybe AI could help you remove? Which parts of your operating model become less competitive if AI changes the way customers expect their banks to behave? And just as importantly, where are you actually organizational ready or not to adopt AI? The expensive mistake, I think, is panicking and buying technology before you answer some of those questions. Because I still see institutions that assume AI is just another software, just another tech innovation we're going to bring on board. We're going to plug it in and see where it goes. They buy a chatbot, they launch a co-pilot, run a handful of pilots. 6 months later, they're in pilot purgatory, right? Yep. The institutions making the most progress really aren't the ones spending the most. They're the ones that are really treating this as a strategic organization-wide shift.
Definitely. Oh, it's such a good point. Yeah, they're not token maxing. They're
right.
doing it in a thoughtful and concerted way, and that is that's super helpful. Well, cool. I guess you something you had mentioned, on our kind of last conversation was, and this is a line that really stuck with me. But when agents start talking to agents and you're invisible, you're gone, and that's where you had touched on AI search too in that last comment you had made. You've literally asked ChatGPT or Claude to describe a bank's checking products, and sort of like describe or define or differentiate, from other institutions. You've gotten nothing back, and 3 of 80 banks showed up at all, just in general, in terms of like the actual return on institutions that you got. So why is agentic discoverability so urgent and pressing, and why do you think financial institutions are still under prioritizing it?
That example you just gave, I actually did live at a conference, and it was a conference of bank marketers, and their minds went, it was like, oh my word, what world have we entered now? And I think it's urgent because discoverability now determines whether or not you're even considered. Mm-hmm. A bank can, as I say, get really efficient, but if you become invisible externally, I don't think banks are just really watching this at all. And the more people lean into AI to find and evaluate products, it's like the question isn't whether you've got a good checking account or whether it's better than the credit union down the street. It's whether AI even knows you exist, mm-hmm. whether these large language models can find you. What's changed is that it's really moving our behavior again from just consulting to acting on our behalf. I've been talking so much more about agentic AI, and the more we move into this space, one of the examples I give as an example, you could ask your smart speaker or ask ChatGPT or Claude or Perplexity, who's paying the highest rate on a 12-month CD, right? The inflection point is when that customer gets to the point where they can ask, okay, move $25,000 into the best insured CDs that you can find and let me just approve it. Because that's agentic commerce. That's where we're moving across the board, not just in banking. And once consumers learn to trust that, banks are going to stop competing for customer attention and start competing for AI's recommendation. I don't know if you know David Birch or have ever read any of his work, but he calls it preparing for the non-human customer. And I think it's simply prioritized because it hasn't been on people's radar screen.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it's not anything they've taken the time to stop and consider. No auditors flagging it, no regulators talking about it. That's why I'm really beating the drum about this these days.
Yeah, I definitely love it from the perspective that, as people start to consider AI in general, they usually think about, all the stuff you mentioned about, internal, process, how are they going to use it inside their institution? But I think the other component, it's not just because we provide a service helping people get discovered on, on AI search, but it's really important that people do consider the fact that theoretically, maybe AI is acting as somebody's like, liaison. They're the other person that they're asking for information. And if you aren't feeding that information to those, sort of like, that AI search, essentially you've lost that connection, and you aren't discoverable, you're not findable. That can be a real problem for long term, as we were just talking, like, if not as many people in rural areas, and then definitely especially in cities, aren't going into branches, you don't have that street corner presence. Where are you? If and it's not just traditional search. It's really, as people start asking more complex questions of these AI search engines, you've got to be there to answer those questions. And if you're not, people won't find you.
And it's not just the search engines, because why do you think all these tech companies are working so hard to get us to use their assistant? Right? Because when we start interfacing with them directly, who's going to own the customer relationship?
True. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the actual institutions themselves. When you walk into a community bank or a credit union that knows it needs to change, what's the real barrier? Is it technology? Is it budget? Is it culture? What are the things that usually prevent them from getting to the next step, or improving upon the experience they deliver?
This isn't going to surprise you at all, but in my experience, it's almost always culture, almost every time. Obviously, budget is real, technology debt is real, but really, when I dig into why a particular initiative stalls, it's almost never because the money wasn't there, right? It's more often it's because, let's face it, human beings, change is hard. It's human nature, and if any institution has been successful for decades, I always say, why are banks still doing this same thing they did 30 years ago? Because they were still making money, right? When they stop making money, then they start asking, well, maybe we need to do something different, and a lot of times, often the person being asked to answer the question about why do we need to even change, they're also the ones who put the original system in place. So, they're the ones that are kind of slowing down the process. You could take two institutions with almost identical budgets and nearly identical technology stacks, and take completely different paths. One transforms in a year, another takes 3 years, and they're still trying to decide what to do. And that isn't resources, it's leadership.
Yeah.
Successful transformation requires leaders. You got to spend your political capital, not just your financial capital. You've got to align people around new directions. You've got to be able to give them permission to experiment and sometimes challenge assumptions that have been in place for years. AI isn't really an IT project. and too often we still think about it in those terms. It's an organizational change project.
Yeah.
It just happens to involve technology.
Yeah, man, that is so powerful. Yeah, I could definitely see that. And you're right that sometimes it is it's the legacy thinking by the people that instituted it that will, plague an organization, not just in the current period, but for the future. And I think that comes into, whether it's adoption, but you're right, leadership is that is absolutely where things start. But that's great. I really appreciate your thoughts on that.
Thanks.
The consolidation numbers are brutal. And it's just getting down to brass tacks and hitting it on the head here. But Cornerstone's data has like new account share down something like 4% for credit unions and 3% for community banks, out of a shrinking pool, essentially. So
Right.
you're advising that institutions rethink mergers just to afford the tech. How should a bank weigh staying independent against consolidate to survive? And what do we lose as a country? Another two-part question here. Sorry. What do we lose as a country when we lose those institutions locally?
I actually don't think the decision really is framed about independence versus survival necessarily. It probably should be framed more, can an institution remain independent while still making investments required to stay relevant, stay safe, especially with fraud ramping up the way it is, and more importantly, stay profitable? If your answer is no, branch consolidation may be one approach. A merger or acquisition might be the most responsible way as well to preserve what that institution's always been trying to do. And you pointed to the Cornerstone data. That's really sobering. But here, let me add one more. I don't know if you saw, but my friend Jennifer White at JD Power produced a report that found that I think it was the third quarter last year, Chime had actually gained a larger percentage of new checking accounts than the 3 largest banks in the country.
Wow.
So yeah, the competitive environment is getting harder. It's getting harder to acquire new customers. And if you're falling further behind each year on tech, you have to think of new ways to keep growing because there is no standing still. There's no status quo these days. And to your final part of that question, though, what we lose when those local institutions start disappearing, there's always that local decision-making, local knowledge of local risk, a banker who actually knows a business owner across the street. Those things begin to be diminished. What I think is happening more, though, we could lose as many as 1,000 institutions over, before the end of this decade, just because scale is becoming increasingly difficult to achieve.
Yeah. That definitely, that is important. I want to dig in on just one thing, and this is more hypothetical than it is anything, but it's interesting as you mentioned, the local sort of expertise and knowledge of, those specific business owners, sort of like, that potentially disappears. Boy, does that offer, also significantly less opportunity of understanding the business climate in that arena. I definitely know for maybe big, organizations like Chime, they can suggest additional financial products. They may be, in a position to start, lending and doing loans. But if they don't understand the community, the opportunity, does that either offer more risk for them to either be taking on things that are, maybe wrong that they shouldn't in terms of like, loans or lending? Or does that put them at, having more trepidation and them not being able to make those investments and essentially not be able to develop those communities in the way? Like, do you see that becoming, corrosive in a way for those individual smaller communities where the sort of like thoughts about how lending gets done are fundamentally changed?
Well, it's interesting because, as I say, there are no boilerplates. There are no like one size fits all, because every market, every community is unique. And I learned that lesson the hard way when one time I was working with a small rural bank in Texas and looked at what was going on in their community and thought some of the same things applied to a rural institution in Nebraska. And I was totally wrong because there were some unique characteristics about each of those institutions that needed to be brought to bear for their next execution, their next strategy. I think oftentimes a lot can occur when a merger happens, as an example, where you don't lose some of those like local characteristics, because while the owning institution may have shifted to a different state, the people that are working in that institution are still local. They still know the community, they know the people in the community, etc. So what is more concerning when you see people pulling back from areas and we start creating more financial deserts than anything else, when everything shifts to digital. We've got a ways to go before we figure that one out, I think.
Definitely. Absolutely. Well, I guess switching topics a little bit, you're part of a fintech book club, or your fintech book club actually is, reading Chris Skinner's The Intelligent Bank in September, coming right up. And you framed agentic AI as changing not just banking's infrastructure, but its business model. The whole emphasis is shifting to sort of data management and mining. What does a bank that genuinely gets this right look like in 3 to 5 years?
3 to 5 years. Again, well, here goes my futurist hat. I will say I'm like halfway through Chris's book, and I'm really excited for the review next month, because one of the fundamental points he makes that if data analytics isn't a core capacity, you're going to lose. So I think the bank that gets it right 3 to 5 years from now, even today, looks very different from the one that we've known for 100 years. How well a bank uses its data and AI to know and serve its customers better are going to separate the winners from the losers. I think here's another piece of this. Some institutions are going to continue to be that visible interface with the customer, but others are increasingly going to become that financial rails for somebody else's brand. They're going to provide the regulated accounts, the payments, the lending, the compliance, all that, while an AI assistant or a fintech or another platform is the one that sits in front of the customer. And that's not necessarily a bad business model, but it should be a strategic choice, not something that happens by accident. Here's another part that's only happened in the last year or so, because being the rails for a non-bank isn't guaranteed anymore, because we've seen with the relaxed kind of regulatory environment, a growing number of fintechs are pursuing their own bank charters, precisely so they don't need the bank sitting between them and everybody else. So the choice for a lot of institutions isn't just customer facing versus rails. It's become the rails now on your own terms while that role is still in demand, or wait until the fintechs take over and, everything shifts. To me, the question isn't whether banks are going to use AI. It's whether they'll stay customer facing seat, or whether they become regulated infrastructure behind somebody else's brand, or if they get squeezed out of both.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Because I definitely know a branch, or I'm sorry, a bank in the Pacific Northwest that is, doing a little bit of both, but they saw the big opportunity of being more the back end player, and
Coastal.
yep, you know exactly who it was. Yeah.
Yeah, I know their CEO really well.
Oh, really? Okay. All right. And that's where
Or former CEO. Former CEO.
oh, fair.
Yeah, he's moved to another bank.
Oh, really? Okay. That's where I've found that situation very interesting. They saw that opportunity, and really putting almost more horsepower behind what was being the backing for some really significant other things. But it's weird that duality is very interesting.
Very much.
Yeah. Well, your whole mission, and this is the last question I got for you. The Bank Forward newsletter, the conference talk seems to be about waking people up in what they need to be watching or looking at. And by the way, I personally think that is so critical, because a couple other things you said, people are kind of easily change is hard, operating in the status quo is easy, and and there's a lot of banks that can make money just by just keep moving on. They've been dedicated to relationships. I've heard it all. So if a community bank or a credit union leader takes away exactly one thing from this conversation and acts on it before they fall behind, what would that be?
Wow. I actually think I kind of said this a few minutes ago, but I'm going to kind of underscore it a little bit. Don't confuse today's success with tomorrow's readiness. Community banks, credit unions have survived for generations because they've adapted. Think of all the change. Think of all the tech that has been added over the last 3 or 4 decades. This moment isn't different because of AI alone, but it's different because several forces, AI, demographics, regulation, payments, changing consumer behavior, they're converging. They're all converging at the same time. And the institutions that wait for any kind of certainty before they act, they're almost going to be responding to somebody else's strategy instead of executing on their own. And I've been saying this a lot lately. You have to step out of your comfort zone, because comfort zone is where community banks and credit unions are going to go to die.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean you need to chase every new technology or make some huge investment tomorrow, but you got to develop the discipline of looking ahead. You have to ask better questions. You have to pay attention to the signals. That's what I write that monthly newsletter for. You have to challenge your assumptions, even if they've served you well for years. Like I said, the goal isn't to predict the future perfectly. It's to put your institution in the strongest possible position, regardless of what future unfolds. So that's really why I do Bank Forward. It's not about making predictions. It's about helping leaders see change early enough that they still have some options.
Well, that's good. I hope everybody subscribes to your newsletter, because I feel like that push or the awareness is so important. It is. It's critical. Complacency is just is not an option, and it's interesting in the marketing field. We've been used to this for now being in business for 20 years. That's part of our DNA, is just
right.
That the ground is shifting under you, and you have to figure out what to do. So I think that is an important note for an industry that definitely has survived on a legacy of sort of like doing things the same way. But it's important that in this age, in this era, as changing sentiments, changing practices, all these things, it's just really important that people start being aware and taking those steps. So thank you for writing a newsletter that constantly addresses that.
And that becomes, I mean, let's face it, change becomes especially hard if you've been doing something for 10 years or 20 years or 30 years. When I see people that have been showing up to work doing something almost precisely the same way all the time, you got to step outside of that.
Absolutely. Well, Jim, you've provided nothing but fascinating information. I mean, like this is great, and I absolutely appreciate your lens and your perspective on things. There anything that you'd like to provide to the audience? Places to find you, the organization. Yeah, definitely feel free.
I was going to say they can always find me on LinkedIn. Hopefully, they can take a look at our website, formarketinsights.com, the longest URL on the planet. But that was what we could get 30 plus years ago. But yeah, send me a message. Always happy to chat.
Oh, well, that's great. Well, really, thank you so much for being a part of the podcast, and thanks for all of your great insights. It was great having you.
Thanks, Brent. Appreciate it.
Definitely. Well, this has been another episode of Mix and Matchbox. I'm your host, Brent Feldman. We'll be back soon with more content. Please like and subscribe. Thanks.